Welcome. My name is Thad Zolkowski. I'm the Associate Director here at the Levy Center, which is in its 11th year, I'm pretty sure, and is funded by a generous grant from the Levy Foundation and Shelby White. Each year we offer 4 residency fellowships. We give $72,000 to people working on biographies. And this year we have as our fellows Rebecca Donner, who's working on a biography of Nazi resistor Mildred Harnack, who is Rebecca's great aunt. Stephen Heyman, who's working on Lost Generation writer and organic farmer Louis Bromfield. Samanth Subramanian, who's working on the biography of the scientist J.B.S. Haldane, and Jennifer Homans, who's working on a biography of George Balanchine. And in the fall, we received a new outside grant from the Sloan Foundation to fund, also for $72,000, a biography of a scientist or someone working in technology. So we'll have a 5th fellowship in the fall. And we also received approval for a new master's in biography and memoir, which is unique in the nation and probably in the world. I'm not sure about that, but it's going to be taught by people from the history and English departments here at CUNY Grad Center. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Peter Filkins, who is a former fellow from the great class of 2014-2015, yeah, and who was working on the biography he's going to be talking about tonight back then, and that biography is of H.G. Adler, sorry, which is just out from Oxford University Press, by the way, and is on sale by care of Books on Call NYC, which is out in the hall, and Peter is going to be signing books afterward, so very important to support that. Adler was a survivor of Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and 2 other concentration camps. He went on to write 24 books of fiction, poetry, history, sociology, and religion, most of which have to do with the lives of those who perished in the Holocaust. Now, there must be some kind of reincarnational connection between Peter Filkins and H.D. Adler, because in addition to writing his biography, Peter has translated 3 of his novels, all of them out from Random House, I believe, right, Peter? Yeah. Panorama, The Journey, and The Wall. And when Peter is not single-handedly bringing Adler to the readers of the Anglophone world, he teaches writing and literature at Bard College, where he is the Richard B. Fisher Professor of Literature. He is also the author of 4 books of poetry and has translated the collected poems of Ingeborg Bachmann, as well as several of her novels. Peter's interlocutor tonight is Eric Banks, who was last here moderating a talk on Joni Mitchell, just to give you some sense of his range. Eric is
singer, not the painter. Not Joan Mitchell, Joni Mitchell.
Well, you have to quote some Holocaust lyrics from Joni Mitchell. Eric is a writer and editor and the director of the New York Institute for the Humanities. And from 2011 to 2013, he served as president of the National Book Critics Circle Award. So please welcome Peter Filkins and Eric Banks. Oh, by the way, there will be a Q&A afterwards, and I'll bring on the microphone.
Thank you all. It's good. It's great to see so many of you join us this evening. I don't know how many of you are familiar with H.G. Adler and his many roles. I'm just curious how many of you have had the opportunity to read his work, whether novels or his sociological studies. Okay, a few people. Well, I thought a great way to start would be to ask Peter to introduce us to Adler very quickly. But before I do that, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to hold this book. I received my copy a couple of days ago. It's hot off the presses. And a lot of us have been following your progress over the years, your work on Adler. This is a tremendous book. It's beautifully written. It's very carefully observed and wonderfully researched. It's a terrific, it's a fascinating biography as a biography. It's very, I know that this is the first biography you've done.
Yeah.
And I imagine it will likely be the last biography
Probably.
you will do. However, it's a remarkable biography in itself. And of course, behind it, it has a figure who's about as singular as you can imagine. There's a quote I want to read from later in the book. This is around page 285, Peter. It's talking about Adler in the 50s, but it's a way of also talking about this particular biography and the shape that it gives to a very particular life. And it goes, some lives move in straight lines, some move in circles, ending where they began as if by clockwork. Others, such as Adler's, are a series of intersecting circles, a journey steered by circumstances and eclectic interests coursing in several directions at once. From the late 1950s onward, which is where we are in this book, his life and work were pulled in different directions, sometimes by events so far beyond his control that chronology no longer traces life's vectors as they crisscross and double back, the hands of the clock moving backward and forward at once. Most often at the center lies Theresienstadt and the wider Shoah, which pursued Adler as much as he pursued them. It's a really beautiful, I love that passage. There's so many in this book that also strike you in such a moving way, and I think really give you a sense of what was unique about Adler and the many experiences he had. And so just as a way of introduction, why don't you give us a quick overview of Adler's life to begin with?
Great.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. It is particularly a great pleasure to be here at CUNY Graduate Center and doing a talk for the Leon Levy Center for Biography. This fellowship landed like a dream in the middle of my life when in trying to write this book. I don't think I could have finished it as quickly without the fellowship, and I think what really needs to be praised is their willingness to take risks on new biographers, not star biographers, and I still remember Gary Giddens calling me and the excitement I had over it, and a wonderful year that I spent here. If you don't know much about H.G. Adler, you are in the majority, but vast majority. Things are changing with the translations of the novels. We got a fair amount of attention for him. And really how this came about was my editor saying, well, if you really want to get him known, you should write a biography. And I sort of dove in, decided to do it. But let me give you a thumbnail sketch. H.G. Adler is Hans Gunther Adler, born in Prague in 1910 to a German-speaking secular Jewish heritage family. This is him at 18 years old. He was rather a dapper fellow. I worked very closely with his son, Jeremy Adler, who the world owes a great debt to because Jeremy kept his works in print and has written about his father quite extensively. But Jeremy once said he was a bit of a dandy as a young man and loved to dress very well. Educated, studies musicology, literature, philosophy, and psychology at the German University of Prague, graduates with a doctorate in musicology in 1935, and wants to commence a life as a writer and intellectual, works for the Prague Urania, which is a continuing education, kind of like the 92nd Street Y. Introduces Thomas Mann and Elias Canetti for readings, does a number of programs for Czech radio network, writing programs for them. So he had a very burgeoning life. Prague was a lively cosmopolitan city of its time. And then, of course, things take a wrong turn. In 1938, he meets a woman named Gertrude Klepetar, falls in love with her right in the middle of the cataclysm, meets her on New Year's Eve, 1938, and she refuses to leave Prague because of her aging parents. He tries to get them out with visas. It doesn't work out, and both of them are deported to Theresienstadt in 1942. And this is Adler in Theresienstadt in 1943. He spends 32 months there, he and Gertrude. Gertrude was the head of the laboratory in Theresienstadt, so she was very responsible for saving many, many lives, including Adler's, because she was so prominent in the ghetto that she was not deported at an early stage because they needed her there to run the infirmary. So it's a much later date. She and Adler deported to Auschwitz in middle of October 1944, along with Gertrude's mother. And Gertrude refuses to leave her mother's side when her mother is selected out and perishes with her in the gas chamber. Adler is not selected. He's a man of 34 years old at that stage, quite fit. He was a bricklayer in Theresienstadt and a valuable worker. So he is sent on to 2 other camps after Auschwitz. Survives the war, returns to Prague in 1945, loses 18 members of his family, and then decides if he can find a woman named Bettina Gross, he says, I can go on with my life. He searches for her address. He had told her in 1938 to get out, and she left for the UK, spent the war working as a designer in a button factory in South Wales, in a place called Merthyr Tydfil, which I happen to have known. You talk about fate and Adler. The first town I visited in the UK in 1977 as a college sophomore was Merthyr Tydfil, and it is a godforsaken place. It's coal country. It's depressing. It's terrible. It's horrible.
I doubt very few people have not been there.
No, exactly. It's the place to go in Wales. Right? Anyhow, that's where she was during the war. She finds his address. He finds her address. Their first letters to each other cross in the mail in 1945 when he's back in Prague. He's interested to find out if she's still single. She is. They begin to write furiously to each other, sometimes 2-3 times a day, and within 6 weeks he proposes marriage to her, not having seen her for 7 years, in the mail. And as I say in the book, I quote her, and she says, Gunther, what have you done? When she gets the letter. But she says yes immediately. Takes him 2 years to get out of Prague, to get a visa. He goes to London, where he's met by Elias Canetti and his boyhood friend Franz Bermensteiner. We'll talk about him. And Bettina. They marry a week later, and that allows him to stay in London, where he proceeds to revise his almost completed draft of his book on Theresienstadt, which is 800 pages long. And I'm trying to think. And that is not published until 1955. He revises it 3 times. And this is him in 1955, and they live in great penury. He does not have a job. He does a few book reviews. Bettina has saved some money from the button factory. His father had some stamps that they had stowed away that they were able to sell, but they lived on just a wing and a prayer. And he refused to take work because he was so committed to writing the Theresienstadt book, and Bettina was committed to supporting him in that. It's published. It is a huge hit. It's reviewed internationally, and it turns him into what he himself called Theresienstadt Adler. And that is, he became known for not only his experience in Theresienstadt, but his scholarship on it. It's really one of the very earliest Holocaust studies books that we have. He almost single-handedly founds the methodology of Holocaust studies. And he starts to go back to Germany to lecture about the camps and also to write for German radio, and then gets a contract at the Institute für Zeitgeschichte, Contemporary History in Munich, to write a book on the entire deportation system called Der verwaltete Mensch, Administered Man, which is eventually published in 1974. In the middle of all this, he's writing novels. He writes between 1947 and 1956, he writes 6 novels and the Theresienstadt book, some 200 poems, and dozens of short stories. I calculated it, it's about 10,000 pages of published work. They don't get published, they end up in manuscript. But if they were published, it would have been 10,000 pages of work. And all of this within a 10-year span of time. So that's kind of, he dies in London in 1988. keeps going back to Germany for research and radio work, and makes his living primarily off the radio work and the lecturing.
It's an incredible life. It's really an incredible story, and particularly the level of productivity he was able to sustain decade after decade in conditions that would be that are unfathomable. First in Theresienstadt, after the war in extreme poverty, working for 7 years in London without really any income, and without anything but his own confidence that this was what he's here to do, is to tell this story, and to tell this story in incredibly interesting and in numerous ways that offer many different perspectives on what he had experienced, which he's one of the few to be able to tell that story.
Well, this is what I actually think is most unique about him, and I sort of discovered early on, is many writers write essays, many writers might even write a memoir, but the scholarship that goes into the Theresienstadt book is serious scholarship. I mean, if you want to know anything about Theresienstadt, if you want to know the calorie count from potatoes that children took in Theresienstadt, you can find it in Adler's book. If you want to know what the announcement of the Jewish Council was on a certain day, you can find it in the Theresienstadt book. If you want to know how Theresienstadt connects to the modern world and his theories of sociology, you can find that in Theresienstadt too. And at the same time, he's writing very intricate, modernist, multi-layered novels. He creates a new style for every novel that he writes. They're all distinct from each other. So this is not someone just writing historical fiction from his experience. This is a very ambitious writer in his own right. He enters Theresienstadt at 32 years old, a trained scholar, and a person. He'd already started writing stories, and he already had a novel going in 1942 when he enters. So he enters Theresienstadt with two different eyes, that of a scholar and that of a fiction writer and a poet, and both of those elements.
And he's able to maintain both visions or sets of eyes throughout the experience.
He says when he gets to Theresienstadt, he wanders around for 6 weeks, depressed, disoriented, finally comes to his senses, if you will, and says, okay, if I survive this, and I probably won't, I will record this experience in two ways, as a scholar and as a writer. And from that moment, he starts writing fiction. He writes 130 poems in Theresienstadt, which he hands off to Leo Bech when he's deported to Auschwitz in a black attaché, which I have a picture of it in the book, and later collects this material. He also starts collecting documents from the Nazi administration and from the Jewish Council of Elders, because Gertrude gets all of the documents as the head of the laboratory. And so things come through Gertrude's laboratory, and Adler says, I'll have that, and hides these documents in her laboratory while he's there for 32 months. So he knows he's going to write a scholarly book about Theresienstadt, and he's going to render it in literary fiction and poetry.
Yeah, it's incredibly resourceful what he was able to do then under the most extreme circumstances. I want to talk a little bit about his life, and then we'll, I think, go on to like slightly bigger themes. And also, I want to sort of start in a second by going back to the period before Theresienstadt. But I do want to talk about this one. One of the things we've talked about a little bit, and one of the things I admire so much about the book is that it's the organization of really 4 different worlds, but also a person who lives in the world in a certain way, and then really lives as a kind of public intellectual through his books in the second part of his life. That the ability to put that together, to think that through in a biography and have it really work as a biography is very impressive. I love the first image that you used in the book, and it tells us a little bit about what he was doing at Theresienstadt. And I probably should have alerted you because we would have possibly a picture of it. Yeah. But it's a note card containing the outline of the lecture that he gave at the camp on Kafka on his 60th birthday, which is an incredible document. Yeah. And it so crystallizes so much about who Adler was. I mean, his interests, his meticulous way with his notes, the fact that this was preserved, the strangeness of that world, which is certainly one way to understand why he felt so compelled to write something that was really an ethnography of Theresienstadt, that you could have a series of public lectures on such things as Kafka's 60th birthday. The odd fact that Kafka's sister was in the audience for this presentation, and then finally the continued connection to the world of Kafka, which I think is just incredible.
Sure. Yeah. No. It's literally the first page of the book is this little note from Adler's archive, which simply says Prague, Kafka underlined, and then has a set of really of just phrases and words of what he wants to lecture on. And then up in the left-hand corner, he writes in pencil Terezin, which is the Czech name for Theresienstadt, years afterwards. So Adler was very good at archiving his own life. He collected all these papers and maintained all his manuscripts. But yes, this is July 3rd, the day after Adler's own birthday, July 3rd, 1943, that he gives a lecture on the 60th birthday of Franz Kafka, who of course died in 1924, and of all places in Theresienstadt. And if you think about it, I am pretty sure I've yet to be disproven. This is probably the only lecture on Kafka in the German-speaking countries of the time, because Kafka was banned. Who would dare lecture on Kafka? Now, why is he doing this in Theresienstadt? Because Theresienstadt has a whole lecture series. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds, thousands of lectures that are given. There are concerts given. There are chamber orchestras. There's a jazz orchestra. There's a tremendous amount of culture that happened in Theresienstadt, and Adler took part in it. And he asked to do the lecture on Kafka, who meant a great deal to him. Ottilie, Kafka's favorite sister, was present in the audience and came to Adler afterwards and said, "On behalf of the family, I thank you." And so the idea that you're lecturing on Kafka in a place like Theresienstadt, of all places. Now, Kafka meant a lot to him as a writer, but also, of course, Adler, born in 1910, was kind of the last vestige of Kafka's Prague. Adler's father went to grammar school with Kafka. Adler himself sat on the same school bench as a nephew of Kafka, and also was in Theresienstadt with that same nephew. The world of Kafka and Prague is an extremely sophisticated art world. There's such a thing as Prague Cubism, which is different than French and Parisian Cubism. Photography has a huge following in in Prague. And Adler knew one of the great photographers, František Dortokal. He was part of his mystical circle, which studied Eastern mysticism, and Dortokal was one of the pioneering of photographers, modern photographers. So it's not an antiquated world, it's very much a very modern world, a very sophisticated cultural world, a very multicultural, very multinational world. In Prague and Czechoslovakia, you could identify yourself as a citizen through your language, through your religion, or through your nationality, and you could make that choice. If you spoke German, you could be a German Czech, and it was an official designation. In fact, it was Adler's designation. And as a result of that, after the war, this is what happens. I have to jump ahead to come back. After the war, he loses his Czech citizenship because anyone who was a German citizen before the war, the Czechs no longer recognized. They were so bitter against the German population of Czechoslovakia.
Well, it briefly was also a very, it was a promising place. I mean, it was a place where liberal democracy looked like it had a chance to thrive.
Yeah. I mean, it's founded in 1919, 1920, has a very enlightened prime minister, Thomas Masaryk, who really believed in democracy and democratic values, was a great defender of the Jews, came out very strongly against the very famous blood libel case that was a great scandal of the time, and said, no, this is nonsense. He took a real stand on behalf of the Jews. This is one of the most democratic, cosmopolitan, in fact, one of the safest places in Central Europe of the time. And those values ended up key to Adler himself, the importance of a strongly structured democratic society which allowed for different kinds of identities to live together and among one another and interact with one another and allow for the tensions too. It wasn't idyllic. There was tensions between the Jews and the Germans and the Czechs all the time. But there was ways to mediate those tensions in that society of the time.
But it was a place where if you grew up as a German-speaking Jew, it was a relatively good place to grow up.
It was.
To be raised.
Yes, no, exactly. I mean,
those years.
and then strangely enough, this this is also part of even the appeal of Theresienstadt at the time. It was not the worst place to be. You were still within Czechoslovakia. You were going off with your family. You were going off with prominent Jews. You thought you were being taken care of for the rest of your life. This was the devil's bargain that was offered to them. But nonetheless, yes, it was a very cosmopolitan, enlightened kind of society. You have to remember, when Czechoslovakia declares its independence in 1920, it's the first time in 1,000 years that they have their own independence, and it only lasts till 1938. There's this very brief window where the first Czech Republic survives.
And also, I mean, you've talked about how it was really a place with these tremendous artists and photographers. It was also a place that nurtured literature in a way that's quite incredible. I mean, we think of Kafka, but there are also people like Čapek. There's there are many different. Many different styles of writing, many different theories of the novel being practiced. There are futuristic things being written, like Čapek, who coins the word robot, apparently. So it's also a place where you get this kind of literary plenitude and promiscuity of styles that I think is also maybe a strong influence on his later literary development.
There's a wonderful tension in Prague art and literature of the time between rationality and irrationality, between the spirit and the imagination, between factuality and fantasy. And it plays itself out across a number of writers. And if you think about Adler, I'm going to write about Theresienstadt factually, and I'm going to write about it fictionally. That tension, that you could employ both of those parts of your brain, if you will, to go about the business of what you're trying to tackle. Yeah,
it's almost striking that it was not more of a Sinne für neue Sächlichkeit, because that makes me think of this other side of Adler. I mean, in a really pronounced way, but I don't necessarily associate that with the Prague of that period.
No. He's more interested. I mean, the other part is, of course, the mysticism. I mean, he's so interested in Eastern mysticism that at one stage, as a high school student, he experiences a moment of rapture where he enters another world, another plane of existence, and is quite taken away. Doesn't really know, but he doesn't fear it. He begins to study Eastern spirituality and begin to figure out large questions of being and God and existence. He does not embrace Judaism at this stage. His friend Franz Berman Steiner seriously does and spends a year in Israel. Adler reads the Jewish mystics, knows the Jewish legends, is very attracted to it, but is not interested in practicing as a Jew. He's not interested in formalized religion at that stage.
Yeah. I want to come back to Steiner in a second. He's a really interesting figure, and his influence on Adler was profound. But I did want you just to say a few more things about his childhood. I mean, you've written that it really was a way to prepare him for later deportation and exile. Do you want to sort of unpack that thought a little bit?
Yeah, the first brief chapter of the book is called The Lecture, and it's about the Kafka lecture and that moment in Theresienstadt. That's where I kind of find him, and everything up to it leads, his life before kind of leads up to that, and everything afterwards kind of stems from that moment. The second chapter, which is your standard where the life begins, is called The Exile. And the reason I called it is if anyone was trained or put through the works to be ready to go into something like Theresienstadt or the camps that he was in, it was Hans Gunther Adler. His mother was bipolar depressive, and very severely so. After his birth, she hangs on for about 5-6 years, but even then he has to be, several of his aunts have to take care of him. And by the time he's 10 years old, she is permanently institutionalized in Prague. His father cared for him, loved him. I have letters where he writes very tenderly to him, but he was a man completely absorbed with his business and was not capable of raising him as a single parent. So at age 10, Adler is shipped out to a foster family in southern Czechoslovakia for a year, which he actually quite loves and spends a lot of time, says, I spent more time in the cow fields than I did in school, and loved being in the cow fields and tending the animals. Comes home for a year and then is sent to a Freemasons Institute in Dresden, which he describes as, quote, my first concentration camp. He was very badly bullied there. He, for whatever reason, in 1922, he and his father are baptized as Protestants, which is a very common event to happen at the time. It probably was a theory either for Emil, his father, to have better business, social relations in Prague, or somehow this was going to help the situation back in Dresden, where he was so bullied as a Jew. It didn't at all whatsoever. Finally, he demanded to come home. And at an aunt's assistant, he was brought home, but then shipped off to another family for 2 more years in eastern Czechoslovakia, who were also quite kind and who he liked very much. So he spent 5 years in foster families or boarding, very severe boarding families, really lost his mother at an early age, really didn't have a caring father in the sense of day-to-day caring. He loved him, but he just didn't know how to care for him.
Well, it sounds like the factors that really brought him into adult life and from a very damaged childhood and a difficult childhood were really this experience with Waldvogel on the one hand, Wandervogel on the one hand, which is a little bit like. Well, you can explain what that was. I think maybe I don't want to call it the Boy Scouts, but it was a little bit like a scouting experience.
It is that, yeah. I mean, it's not our kind of notion of the Boy Scouts, though.
Yeah.
This was a huge movement in Middle Europe, Germany. I mean, millions and millions of boys and even girls were involved in the Wandervogel scouting movement, and they would have massive meetings of different factions, and there were competing factions. There were the communist scouts, and there were the conservative scouts, and there were the social democrat scouts, and they all would write their credos, and these were highly idealistic young men. Peter Demetz, the very renowned German scholar who knew Adler in Prague at the time, I interviewed Peter, who's still alive, still with us, thankfully, said that he thought that the values that Adler learned in the Wandervogel were what saved his life. That his physical conditioning, he loved to hike. Nature is always a safe place in Adler. Nature is neutral, nature is God-given, and it's beautiful. And any chance that he ever had to experience, to be in nature was soothing to him.
Yeah.
And then the idealism of decency, honesty, respect, care for your neighbor, treating someone, the golden rule, treating others as you would want to be treated yourself, that these became a credo for this generation. And he and people like Steiner absolutely lived by it and carried that kind of credo through their experience.
And I was going to say the other side of that, which is very much part of that experience, is that close camaraderie with his fellows, and particularly with these strong bonds that he forms with other people.
It became the family that he didn't have, and you're right. It taught him, and there's been scholarship written about this, that one of the most crucial things you could have going through the camps was a friend. To have a significant other with whom you could go through the experiences and talk about and watch out for each other and share the experience, that simply that the worst thing to be was to be alone. And the Wandervogels taught him the idea of being in groups and experiencing the world as small communities who had shared values among themselves.
And this is also the time that he starts to develop these really strong bonds with friends like Steiner,
Yeah.
who becomes a really significant, probably the most significant single figure in his life and his development. You've talked a little bit about that relationship, about especially the time that they spent in nature, that they spent hiking, their kind of back and forth about Steiner's Zionism, but their shared interest in mysticism. So we've talked a little bit about that. It's also through him that he's first exposed to a particular kind of anthropological way of seeing the world. And Steiner will go on to become a very important anthropologist in Britain, dies shortly after the war, as we talked about the other day, shortly after proposing to Iris Murdoch, as a matter of fact.
Exactly. Literally hours
Literally.
after.
Yeah, he dropped dead on the phone after he talked to Iris Murdoch, and she apparently said yes. And there's actually an erotic bond there, too, with Canetti, which is his other friend, which is an interesting aspect of the Adler world.
Yeah.
But can you say a little bit about that how he was introduced to anthropological theories, which were, certainly something that was very much current in the 30s. We were talking the other day about I was impressed with the way that Malinowskian ethnography had made its way to that part of the world, because I think of it as very much of an American import and connected to Boasian anthropology. But I don't want to get ahead of myself, but can you say a little bit about that, what it was that he absorbed from Steiner?
Well, I think the first thing to say is Adler absorbed so many things.
He was tremendously learned.
Exactly, and this was also common at the time. So did Steiner. Steiner was a trained biologist. They had they grew up together on literally around the corner from each other. They had a massive collection of specimens that they shared of rocks and lichen and mosses and butterflies and salamanders, I don't know what. So to study many things simultaneously was a very common thing in Mitteleuropa. That's what an intellectual was in those days. Steiner is very avid and interested in anthropology, and he introduces Bronislaw Malinowski's theories, anthropological writings to Adler. In fact, Adler goes and pinches Steiner's Malinowski book from Steiner's library and reads up on it. And this one of the central ideas of Malinowski is the notion of the participant observer, of being with the way to understand a culture is to immerse oneself as deeply as possible within that culture and simultaneously stand back and observe the culture and your behavior within it. This became key to Adler, not only as a way to move through life, but actually as a method of surviving Theresienstadt and the camps, to be in the moment, to know what was happening in front of you, but also to think of the larger context, to think of how are you going to carry yourself through this moment? How are you going to be when you come out the other end of this moment? Are you going to be able to live with the values that you stood by in that moment? And how does Theresienstadt fit into the broader picture? This then becomes his life work. Rather than thinking about my experience. There's very little Adler in his Theresienstadt book. You have to wait till the beginning of the section of notes where he gives you 2 pages and says, yes, I was deported on such and such a day, and with my wife and her parents, and I was here for so many months, and then I went to this camp and that camp. It all takes 2 pages, and he says, done, that's it. He doesn't talk about his own experience in the book itself whatsoever. He's looking out at the world around him, trying to get it down as accurately as he can, at the same time that he's trying to look at it from 30,000 feet and figure out what does this mean for this moment, and what's it going to mean for the history to come after it, and what is the history that preceded it, that led up to it.
Well, that's one of the things that's interesting, is that when he writes the books, when he's attempting to write the books after the war, and we can talk about and after the Holocaust, we can talk about this a little bit, I think, in a minute. But there's always this resistance to what is considered a subjective interpretation of history. And there are historians who say you cannot write from this position, you have to write from an objective and analytic position. Your experience in some way disqualifies you from some kind of objective distance, which the practice of history requires. And of course, that's always an argument he has with Adorno, which we'll talk about in just a minute, with Theodor Adorno, which I always find that a little bit odd in relationship to Adler, because his writing as a scholar is actually distanced. It's very much, I mean, the participant side is obviously there and not by choice, but it's tilted, it seems, very much toward the observer. It's not I mean, Malinowski, I don't think, really writes himself that much into Argonauts of the Western Pacific either, but it's certainly not sort of a particular style of Geertzian anthropology. You don't feel, I mean, he really does feel more removed maybe than even most ethnographers would be in relationship to their material.
I think what's a little different with Adler is he is removed, but he's often looking at the experience, particularly in the Theresienstadt book, with the eye of a fiction writer. He said in the Theresienstadt book that he wanted it to be lively, engaging, like a Kafka novel with reverse signification. Meaning, what he meant by that is that Kafka takes the world of the nightmare and turns it into the everyday.
Yeah, it's a particular kind of realism.
Exactly. And Adler takes the world of the everyday and easily shows it the nightmare side of it. So it's just the flip side of Kafka. And just the way he will describe certain things, you realize you're in the hands of a literary artist as much as you're in the hands of a scholar. And those two, they're competing within him in all his writings. And then in the novels, you read the novels and you realize you're in the hands of a scholar and a philosopher and a sociologist at the same time that you're in the hands of a literary magical realist at times.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting way that that sensibility was really shaped by the experience. It doesn't feel like he went to Theresienstadt with that sensibility ingrained. It really was something that happened once he was there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Malinowski was there, the idea of the participant observer, but then I think he sort of pulled that methodology off the shelf and said, I can make use of this. And then the more he did it, the more payoff it gave to him, and then that became the post-war work as well.
Well, before we leave, and I see that we're actually getting far along in time, before we leave the pre-war nexus of Steiner and Adler and the world of Prague, do you want to read very quickly the little passage as the walls start to close in? Because Steiner was not able to rescue Adler from Prague. He was not able to get out. Canetti was no help.
Yes, Steiner
he frequently was no help.
Right, exactly. Steiner gets out of Prague in 1938 and goes to Oxford and spends the war working in Oxford as an anthropologist. Canetti also gets to England. And so the great tension for Adler became to try to escape. And I try to capture this moment in a number of different ways. This is 1939, just after the Nazis have invaded Prague. On March 20th, the old new synagogue in Prague was set on fire, and in May, the viceroy of the protectorate, Konstantin von Neurath, decreed that Jews were banned from civil service, the courts, working in the stock market, and as teachers in schools. It took until July for Adolf Eichmann to set up the Central Office for Jewish Emigration in Bohemia and Moravia, which all Jewish congregations in the protectorate had to answer to. But before then, nearly 9,000 Jews fled the country, while another 10,000 left before the end of the year. Adler was not among them, for neither Steiner nor Canetti did much to save him. After the war, Steiner admitted to Rudolf Hartung, "My incompetence and impracticality prevented me from getting him out before the war. But in fairness, it was not easy. A sum of £50 had to be paid to the Home Office as a guarantee, although Britain also sharply curtailed the number of visas. Canetti's silence, however, disturbed Adler, who complained to Steiner, "I find it very strange that at such a time, Elias does not answer any of your questions. These are really not the kind of pleasant times in which one can let letters go unanswered." Years later, in the novel Die unsichtbare Wand, The Wall, the first draft of which Adler completed in 1956, Arthur Landau questions the motives of Oswald Bergman, a stand-in for Canetti, and why he ignored pleas to help Arthur emigrate, even though Bergman acknowledges that an unanswered letter can result in a murder in times of crisis. Arthur realizes Oswald was not a murderer, but his neglecting to answer my letter felt as if he were. Adler continued to feel wounded by the unwillingness of his friends to help him get out. At the time, Adler knew that he was making demands, and he apologizes for any duress he has caused them. I perhaps am writing in impatience, he writes to Steiner on April 24th, 1938, and sharing with you every last detail of the very real situation here with the false assumption that doing so might provide some possible way out of it. But don't think I am at all uneasy. Whoever sees clearly can quite easily tamp down all such distress. I am really quite fine, end quote. And yet he was not. Time was running out. Something had to happen soon. Something did happen. Gunther fell in love. And that's when he meets Gertrude. So I guess why we thought about sharing this passage is, in writing the biography, I had to try, in some ways, do what Adler does in his writing. Bring the history in, tell about Prague, tell about the Nazis invading, and give the details, because it's unique in Prague. It's a country that is sort of swallowed up whole, rather than suppressed like Poland. It's allowed to still be a protectorate, a country in its own right, though of course there was a rump state. And at the same time, the struggle of Adler with Steiner and Canetti to try to get out, but then to leap ahead to the novel where he writes about that struggle, and then to make use of Steiner's letters, and then, of course, always to come back to the moment itself, Gunther fell in love. And that's kind of, I think, how the biography, the book as a whole works.
Yeah, it's got these, there are these, like I say, it exists really in four different worlds: the world of Prague, the world of Theresienstadt, and then three other camps, Auschwitz and two other camps, of London, and then of post-war Germany. And I think you do a remarkably good job of capturing his, incredibly unlikely survival, while everyone around him, whom he knows in the camps die. Everyone dies, and he's one of the few survivors. And you give, the figures are kind of incredible when that you give in the book about the likelihood of survival. I think it's about 400 to 1 or something like that. And you also do a remarkably good job, I think, of setting out the sociology of the camps, but particularly Theresienstadt. But there are several figures that he meets there, like Leo Beck, that are so important to him. And then there's also a way that I think is, again, remarkable, but that there's a way that he comes to find a particular kind of, so spirituality might be the word for it. It's a particular kind of faith and a particular kind of Judaism that he sort of discovers in Theresienstadt through these meetings with some Orthodox Jews who were...
It's actually Auschwitz.
It's Auschwitz. Yes, I'm sorry. I thought it was in Theresienstadt.
No, it's the gypsy camp. He meets Leo Beck. He was quite close with Leo Beck, who was the head of Germany's Jews. And they talked a lot about Judaism in Theresienstadt. And of course, he leaves all his papers in that black briefcase, which he comes back in 1945 after surviving, goes straight to Theresienstadt to collect his black briefcase, and Leo Beck has it. And as I say in the book, he walks out of Theresienstadt in June of 1945 with the next 40 years of his life in that black briefcase, because it's got all the Theresienstadt papers, it's got his poems, it's got his stories, it's got the start of a novel, and everything just goes right from there. No, when he gets to Auschwitz, he's quarantined in a work camp and then put into the gypsy camp, which had already been emptied out of gypsies disastrously. And there he meets a group of Orthodox Jews from Slovakia, particularly a man named Max Schiff. And almost like sophomores in college, they stay up all night debating religion in the gypsy camp. And Schiff comes to him and says, I can see that you are a pious man and that you pray. And Adler says, I'm barely Jewish at all. I don't know. He says, doesn't matter. It's there within you. says Max Schiff. And Adler sort of is taken aback, and they literally spend hours and days discussing Judaism. Max Schiff is also then, along with Adler, is sent to his next camp, Niederroschel. So these discussions happen. Again, this is a significant other, right? Here's a pairing, a significant pairing, somebody to talk the hours away with. And it's really in the camps that he comes to Judaism. He never practices. Never goes to synagogue, never celebrates the high holidays in any significant manner, but he begins to embrace Judaism and begins to write about it quite eloquently. Later on, post-war.
I'm going to skip ahead and just ask a couple of things that I want to bring up before we turn it over to your questions. There are two significant figures that he interacts with once he is able to publish the Theresienstadt book after many years of work.
Yeah.
He becomes something of a public intellectual in Germany. He's involved in the Eichmann trial. And the two figures that I really wanted to ask you about are first his relationship with Hannah Arendt, which is not a very good relationship. He's quite critical of her, even though she's, I think, the first person really maybe to mention him in an English language text in the New Yorker when she's writing the what will become Eichmann in Jerusalem.
Right.
And the second person is obviously Adorno, who he enjoys, or enjoys is not the right word, he has a relationship with on and off after the war. Do you want to say a couple of, before we start to wrap it up? And
they're as we say, complicated relationships.
Yes, these are the subjects for several hours of conversation.
Early on, Hannah Arendt, along with, the Sleepwalkers.
Hermann Broch.
Yeah, Hermann Broch is in Princeton. Arendt and Hermann Broch tried to help Adler get the Theresienstadt book published. So she knows of it, and she's a big fan of it. So there is some communication between them, then not directly, but via Broch. And then I'll come back to her. Then Adorno, when the book is finally accepted by J.C.B. Moore, Paul Seebach of Tübingen, Germany, who agreed to publish it without even finishing it. Only had read about the first third of it and wrote to Adler and said, I will publish this without even I haven't even finished it yet, and I know I'm going to publish it, but I need 8,500 marks, Deutschmarks, for a subvention to pay for the printing costs, which was a huge sum of money at the time. And Adler goes to Germany and actually writes to Adorno. He had corresponded with Adorno because he reviewed Adorno's book on music for the BBC in 1951. And they begin to correspond. He goes to see Adorno, and Adorno arranges for the subvention of the Theresienstadt book. So the T-book, as we call it, would not have seen the light of day without Adorno.
Without Adorno's support.
And Adler knew that. And he also wrote a very important letter for Adler's case for reparations. So he supported him on that.
But he did not take his work serious. Certainly his literary work, he did not take seriously.
No, that was that he really felt this, as you alluded to earlier, that again the notion that Adler was too close to this subject matter. He could not be objective as a scholar. He could not see it for all it was because he was too immersed within it itself. And he didn't think that the great statement of Adorno, you can't write to write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric, though he really later retracted that. I also point out he didn't say you couldn't write a poem; he just said it was barbaric.
Yeah, and he was really talking about a certain kind of lyric poetry as well. As slightly.
But he didn't. He knew. He thanked Adler. Sent him his novels when Analyzer when it was published finally. But it's not clear that Adorno even ever read it. That he ever gave much truck to it. Now to finish up with Arendt. She publishes Eichmann in Jerusalem. It's translated into German, and it was only when it appeared in German that he decided to weigh in on it because he didn't feel right weighing in America. It was when he began to be asked about it in Germany itself. And he found all kinds of factual errors in it, and that she had lifted sort of so many ideas from his own book and from Eugen Kogan as well. And he writes a tirade of an article in a German newspaper Was weiß Hannah Arendt über den Shoah or Holocaust? I can't remember which one it is. And he just tears into her. He writes a half-hour radio program on her, and he just was livid with her.
Yeah.
And he also, sorry?
That's the follow-up.
Criticize Hannah Arendt.
Because factually, and there are errors in Arendt's scholarship, and also he did the banality of evil. He did not accept that. He said the Eichmann you saw in Jerusalem was not the Eichmann of Theresienstadt, and evil is never banal. So that was his central point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's there's a way that telling the story, you're telling the story also of all these people around Adler, in addition to telling us about the times in which he lived. You've said when I first talked to you about this that it's interesting that you came to Adler the way that you did. You're not a historian and you're not a Holocaust scholar.
Yeah.
I guess there's a couple of last questions before we turn it over for your own questions. How did you discover Adler for yourself? Because you've translated 3 novels.
Yeah. This has been 18 years I've been.
It's a remarkable dedication.
Yeah. I'm actually going to tell a late story, which is actually kind of funny. Adler visited Vienna when he was a boy, and did not visit it again until 1970 for the first time. And he started to go to Vienna a lot and doing a lot of lectures, particularly for the Gesellschaft für Literatur, the Society for Austrian Literature. And he would always stay at the Academia Hotel in Vienna. And I've been very fortunate when I was doing my work on Ingeborg Bachmann. I had a couple of translators fellowships from the Gesellschaft für Literatur, and I also stayed in the Academia because the Gesellschaft owned an apartment in the hotel. I figured out I was sleeping in the same bed as Adler. Like 30 years later, it's like, this is weird.
That's
this is
really
strange. Yeah, it's got a little too creepy. But yes, I was in Schönhaus, a foreign language bookstore in Harvard Yard in 2001, kind of hunting for a new translation project, pulled Eine Reise, The Journey, off the shelf, read 2 pages, and knew I had to translate it. I just knew it in my gut that I had to do this. Now, I'm not Jewish. I'm not a Holocaust historian. I'm a writer, a poet who knows German, does some translation. It was the sentences. It was the style. I wanted to make English sentences like those sentences. I describe The Journey as Elie Wiesel's Night written by Faulkner. And that's really how the whole thing kind of operates. And once I heard those sentences, I was hooked. And I didn't. It was a while before I read the rest of the novel. I didn't know who he was. It took me 6 years and 40 publishers before I found somebody to publish it, and it ended up being Random House. So.
Yeah. If you've not read the novels, you must read them in Peter's wonderful translation, and you must pick up the biography on your way out as well. So why don't we now turn it over to your questions? And I feel like I owe you an apology. There's so much in this book that I want to talk about.
A lot.
So.
There's a lot more that I even got to. Yeah.
Hi, I happen to know a survivor of Theresienstadt, and he had the good luck, I don't know how he did this, that when he never was sent to another camp, that at the end of the war, he was able to get a C-47 to fly him back to Holland. And for the rest of his life, which hasn't ended yet, he never set foot in Germany, as a matter of course. Adler did.
Yeah.
He went right back.
Yeah.
Wasn't he criticized and hated by many Jewish survivors for having thrown himself right back into the German literary and journalistic world?
Well, again, he was going back in order to do research on the camp. So in other words, he's taking up the cause of covering the deportations themselves. He always considered himself a German writer. He did not want to live in Germany. He said, I will not live in a country that was ever controlled by Hitler. I just won't do that. And then it became frankly, his bread and butter because of the radio work that he had to go back. He never goes back to Prague because of the communist putsch happens in 1948, and he leaves in 47 primarily because he can see that coming. You are reminding me of a nice moment in Adler. One of the treasure troves I had is that Adler kept a diary, a pocket calendar, of every day of his life in the post-war world, from kind of up to 1952, and there's a break, and then 1956 onwards. He would record what music he listened to, who came to visit, who he wrote letters to, who he got letters from, what concert he went to, and what trip he made. And one of the trips, he's actually a member of the International Auschwitz Committee and has to go to Poland for the conference, the annual meeting of the International Auschwitz Committee, and simply says in the pocket calendar, flew over Theresienstadt. That's all it says. Mm-hmm. It's just, you think, what does that mean? Is that, but just flew over Theresienstadt.
Yeah,
that's it.
It's incredible.
I was quite surprised to find that he was able to do some writing and research in Theresienstadt, and also his papers were to be found after the war.
Yeah.
But also I wanted to ask you, was he in a position to help others in the camp, even by writing down names and identifying them to relatives back home, or any way like that?
Yeah. Well, of course, many survivors did. This is one of your first duties, obviously, as a survivor, was to write to relatives. His first letter to Bettina was to tell her that her mother had died in Auschwitz, and this is just what a duty you did. He helped through Gertrude. He helped tend to the people that he knew. He did not. Most of his work in Theresienstadt was menial labor, mostly as a bricklayer. He he could have participated in the administration, and he did not want to be part of that. He did not want to be part of drawing up the deportation lists and putting on the kind of cultural show that the Nazis wanted. He saw that as a sham, the fact that you had a cafe in Theresienstadt, soccer games, and the rage against the the film made for the Red Cross.
The story of the film is incredible.
Oh,
I mean, it's a pretty well-known story, but it's just remarkable.
Yes.
Yeah. And then they were all deported as soon as they made the film.
That's exactly. All the makers of the film, the next day, once the visit was over, were sent to Auschwitz where they died.
Yeah.
So as far as him being able to Gertrude had a typewriter as head of the laboratory. So he had access to it. He was one of the few people who had access to a typewriter. This is, again, a little sort of backstory of writing the book. Adler's archive consists of 320 boxes of about this, with 10 to 12 files in them of stories, unpublished, published, essays, novels. There are 4 novels that have not been translated still. And he wrote 10 to 15 pages of letters in the German Literary Archive in Marbach, Germany, just outside of Stuttgart. And he wrote 10 to 15 pages of letters per day for 40 years to editors, to friends, to Bettina, his second wife, back in London when he was in Germany. They're all typed. It was the first thing. I went in 2010, which was his centennial. There was a little conference in Marbach. I went 2 days early, raced through the archive to see what was there. And when I saw it was all typed, I said, I think I can do this.
He was left-handed and was
He was
forced to write
left-handed as a
right-handed. He
boy.
had horrible handwriting.
It was
right?
so, and they forced to be a righty. His handwriting was so bad that he started typing when he was like 12 years old. To his family members couldn't read his handwriting.
For taking the question. Again, I'm curious. I've always been curious. I have to go back to what that gentleman said. Most Jews who were anywhere near a camp will never put their foot in Germany.
Yeah.
I'll say 99%.
Yep.
And the fact,
Yep.
and I'm not condemning him for this, I'm wondering why. Maybe he was a German Jew. You said that in Prague.
German-speaking
Yeah,
Jew.
and so he had a lot of sophistication. He was very curious, very respectful. Still, he's not here.
Yep.
But I'm wondering why.
He had to
I
tell
mean-
this story.
I mean, you know-
And that's the reason for the quick marriage between him and Bettina. This was a pact. They were there to tell the story of the lost, and that he.
I know, but to tell it in Germany.
Well, you had to.
The lecture in Germany.
Yeah.
You know, that's just interesting.
Yeah, no, it's, yeah, but he,
You know.
he actually goes back in the middle 50s and writes to Bettina. Oh, go ahead, please.
I have to just tell you that an artist, Andreas Schiff, he's a great
Yeah.
Bach
Oh,
pianist, you
yeah.
know,
Oh, yeah.
comes from Hungary. I heard him say, I will never go back to Hungary
Yeah.
because of what they did. I will not put my foot unless there is some kind of epiphany in that country. So that's really
Yeah.
the feeling.
Yeah, I think the other thing important to say, and this is where Adler is, it's an interesting part of him, he did not feel that the workings of the Holocaust were only particular to the Jews and the Germans. He in fact said, this will happen again. That the mechanisms of modernity, of bureaucracy, of objectification of the individual. I'll get a little political here, but when I sit home and I look at what some things are happening on the border, I say there is Gunther, there's Adler. You know, when those children are separated and put in. I'm sorry, it's like.
There's a reason that his last great work is titled Administered Man.
Yeah.
It's really Administered Man.
Human administered.
And it's very much about the modernity and bureaucracy.
Yeah.
And actually has such a close relationship with Adorno. I don't mean to bring it back to
that's
Adorno,
true.
but it's really, you know, it's Frankfurt School understanding of
Yeah.
you know, what happens in modern society. And when you have basically a way of governing human beings
Yeah.
in an impersonal way
Yeah.
and treating them as something with
Yeah.
lacking humanity. But
Yeah. Or even something, look,
Catalogs.
or something like Facebook, where we become data points.
yeah, it's
You know,
very
this is the-
Weberian. I
right?
mean, it's
Yeah.
yeah.
Someone, yeah.
Have Holocaust deniers addressed Adler's work?
No, that because I think the main reason is because he's so unknown. It's really he's just no one. The Germans didn't know of him. Who knew of him? It's really what was the breakthrough for me in a funny way was W.G. Sebald. If you've read his novel Austerlitz, at a critical point in the novel, Austerlitz wants to learn more about Theresienstadt, where Austerlitz's mother died. And there's a 12-page long sentence about Theresienstadt and Adler's book. Adler shows up. In fact, if you read the novel, you just think he's some made-up character. And it's actually H.G. Adler, and the map that Sebald puts in his novel is Adler's map of Theresienstadt. And so I read that as Sebald saying, if you want to know about the Shoah, I can take you so far, because Sebald was not a survivor, or but if you really want to know, you're going to have to go to Adler, and he was one of the few people who knew of his work. When I finished The Journey, that was the first novel that I translated. I had to write an introduction, and I thought, well, who is Adler like? And I thought, I'll go and look at some encyclopedias of Holocaust literature and Jewish writers and things like that. He doesn't appear. His name's not there. And I think because he is so unlike anyone else and was so unknown, so I think that's why he doesn't get.
Just following up on that, did he work with Yad Vashem?
Yeah, he never. He went to Israel and Jerusalem twice, but so he didn't do a lot of research. They were fairly short trips, but yes, he did a lot of exchange of documents and searching down documents. Yeah.
We should add that the Theresienstadt book has been fairly recently translated.
Yes, it's available from Cambridge University Press in Belinda Cooper's translation. They were working on it before I even came on the scene. It took a long time to produce the book. It came out in 2016 from Cambridge University Press. So.
And so it actually, in this country, trailed the novels.
Novels.
Yeah, which is such an interesting
Yeah.
inversion of
Yeah.
the way he was known in Germany.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I see someone else has a question. I was just going to ask you, is there any interest in this book being translated into German?
We haven't. I just haven't had a chance to explore. You know, it's hot off the press. I have some contacts. I'm also hoping they'll be translated into Czech.
Yeah.
I would really love to see it appear in Prague. And his novels are translated into Czech. And after we did the English translation of the novels, they appeared in Italian, French, Spanish, Czech, and Hebrew. As well. In fact, the Italian and the French translations won awards. They're celebrated translations.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Did he know Paul Celan?
He met him a couple of times. He didn't have. He was not a great fan of Celan's poetry. It was too hermeneutic for him. It was too inaccessible, although Adler's poetry is pretty difficult in itself. Again, his poems, the early poems in Theresienstadt are quite visceral and quite violent in their depictions. But then he actually said he consciously began to develop a remove, writing about nature, writing about God, writing about love. He writes love poems to Gertrude in Theresienstadt because that was a way to survive.
Yeah.
He couldn't sit there and write yet another poem about a guard beating up an inmate. He was not a fan of Celan, although he became good friends with Celan's widow, Giselle. And actually had two prints that Giselle was a printmaker artist, and he and Bettina had two prints that Giselle gave to him. Yeah, he was very upset by Celan's suicide. That really bothered him. He really felt tremendous empathy for Giselle, and wrote to her, and that started their friendship.
It's incredible.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. It's great. Thank you.